Welcome, everybody, to our third webinar in our series on navigating chaos communication strategies for uncertain times. This webinar on coalition and community building is brought to you by Bowie 231 Consulting, Mighty Bytes, and Illuvium Gatherings. Feel free to introduce yourself in this chat. We're all really happy that you joined us this afternoon. Um, on to the next slide.
Sure. Can you all see those?
Yep.
Okay, great.
All right. My name is Nicole Hunter. I'm a project manager at Mighty Bytes, and I will be serving as the host for this webinar series. In our first couple of webinars, we talked about storytelling as a basis for strong communication strategies. We also talked about how we can build resilience into our communication strategies in the chaos of our current landscape. Today, we'll begin a conversation on how to build strong communities that advance our shared goals through collective action. And here to help us find our footing in today's discussion, we have our panelists. Kel, would you like to start?
Hello, everybody. My name is Kel Moody. I use they, them pronouns, and I run a business called Illuvium Gatherings, where I focus on environmental and social justice-based movement building events. So all the time about community building, trust building, and collective education. Great to be here.
Tim, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'll go next. Tim Frick from Mighty Bytes. I use he, him pronouns. And this is the third webinar in the series of Navigating Chaos. And I want to thank everybody who's come, especially those to these events, especially those who have come over to each one again and again. Really appreciate that. And I'm excited to be here and have this talk about community building and coalition building. Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jennifer Caddick. I use she, her pronouns. My company is Bowie 231 Consulting, and I support nonprofits with their communications and advocacy campaigns. And echo what Tim said. Thanks so much to everybody who has come to our previous conversations. They've been really meaty, and I'm excited to have this chat today with Kel.
Thank you. Today we are tackling three primary topics related to coalition and community building, mainly strategy, governance, and action, which is just the beginning. This is a very broad topic. But first, we need to get through some housekeeping items. So the conversation today should take about 40 minutes. We'll reserve about 15-ish minutes for questions and answers at the end of the sessions. To submit a question, you can use the chat or use Zoom's Q&A feature, and we'll get through as many as possible. Finally, I'll be sharing links in the chat for anything that we talk about today, and we'll also send a follow-up email after this webinar has concluded that will also contain those links. So let's start with a quick review of what we've covered so far in the series. During our first webinar, Jim Pollock from Story Studio Chicago joined us to discuss how strong storytelling drives successful communication strategies. For those interested in the resources from that webinar, I will share those in the chat right here. And in the second webinar, Bridget Heyman from Access Living joined us to discuss creating inclusive and more resilient communication strategies that can withstand turbulent times. And again, the recordings and shared resources. And hi, Jill. I see you in the chat.
Thanks, Jill, for coming. Appreciate you showing up.
So to kick us off, we're going to talk about communication. Community means strength. So first off, could each of you share some examples from your personal experience with creating collective action through community? Don't know who wants to start that off. Kel.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I mean, so I feel like there's like most of the work I do is really rooted in building these types of communities around like some sort of purpose or action. And I feel like, you know, one of the most recent examples is I did an event with the San Juan Islands agricultural community. And basically this is an event that happens annually, which is kind of their one time a year that this community gets to gather and connect and build more relationships with one another, but also really learn from each other and have that kind of collective shared learning experience. And I think what's interesting about the combination of like, okay, we're all together, but we're also all together doing something around like increasing our knowledge and skills and like kind of coming together around a particular purpose. And it feels like in those cases, the trust and the connections can be more deeply built when you have that kind of intention around why are we here. And so a big reason why I focus my work around gatherings is because it can really create that kind of shared collective learning and strengthening experience. And so I feel like having that intention or purpose, or what is the what are we doing together, and having that ability to really work on defining that can be really helpful in building community around a particular initiative or cause.
Awesome. Uh, Jen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So my expertise is primarily in the environmental advocacy space, and have worked in all kinds of coalitions to, change laws or regulations or protect whatever piece of the world that that coalition needed to protect. And one example that I think about a lot is the community that I live in now, that I've worked in on and off for quite a few years. And I am in very upstate New York, in a place called the Thousand Islands, so on the US-Canadian border, where Lake Ontario becomes the St. Lawrence River and it heads out to the ocean. And I mention that because probably nobody on this call, unless you know me personally, knows where that is. But there are a lot of powerful interests that want to influence what happens here, because we are a key linchpin between the ocean and the Great Lakes ports. And so the St. Lawrence Seaway passes through us, and there are all kinds of environmental issues with the Seaway. There's also a major hydropower dam here, and there's all kinds of environmental issues with that. And this community is very small, but has consistently created really interesting coalitions between local folks and our summer residents. And as you can imagine, there's a wide range of uh, lived experiences amongst those folks, socioeconomic differences, and people who probably would not find themselves together at a table if it weren't for their shared value of this place and a value of protecting this place. And time again, I have seen the strength of that coalition, because we have fought off major proposals that are pushed by some really big interests. The Midwest Great Lakes powerhouse ports and that political power. Upriver, downriver, we have the city of Montreal and a major port, and we're sort of stuck in this little tug of war between the two. And so seeing people willing to put aside some of their differences that they might have otherwise, to focus on that shared goal and shared value is incredibly powerful. And I've watched this community win time and time again, to the point where people are like, who the heck are you guys? Where are you from? And they start to pay attention to us. And so, I think that shows the power of what a coalition can do if there is a shared value and built trust over time.
Thanks, Jen. I'll go next. I have a couple thoughts and to share here. First, Kel, I'm so glad you're here. Mighty Bytes has been focused on or supporting or an advocate for online community building for decades now. And there are a lot of challenges with that right now with social media and various online platforms and stuff like that. And so the example that I'm going to give is actually one of experiential power. And so I really appreciate, Kel, that you're focused on that specifically in your work. I was a board president for an organization called Climate Ride for several years, and on their board for 6. And they do like fundraising bike rides. So they're like multi-day, really kind of challenging bike rides through places like Glacier Park and Death Valley and some of our most amazing natural spaces. And so the multiple multi-day rides that they produce end up being very transformative experiences for people, because they really pushed themselves physically and mentally to do something that they weren't sure that they were able to do. And they do it together over the course of multiple days. And these end up becoming really, really transformative. And this transformational power in turn drives their community. And I think that's a really, really great way to think about community building and stuff. And they really take these inspiring, exciting experiences. Not everybody can get on a bike for 5 days, obviously, but what they do really well. And they support the riders throughout the experiences. And then each night there is an inspiring speaker that is talking about issues that are related to the ecosystems that they are in. So, issues with Death Valley or the Great Lakes or wherever the event is located, they focus specifically on local issues. The other quick example I was going to get is just generally the B Corp community. It's one of the most passionate communities I've ever gotten involved with, and that shared passion is really infectious, and I'm sure Kel will be able to kind of back that up as well. It really drives all kinds of different networks. Kel and I have been involved in the Be Proud network. I've been involved in the B Corp Marketers Network. We've both been involved in Be Local networks in Illinois and Portland, respectively. And there's a lot of passion there, and that passion brings joy and it really makes everybody excited to collaborate. All that being said, I share these examples because they are examples of joy and the power of joy and collaboration and stuff. But there also is a time and a place for anger, and right now happens to be one of those times. Most human rights movements owe the progress that they've made to some level of civil disobedience. So I just want to acknowledge that we're in this space, and I still advocate for creating joy and passion and co-creating that passion and stuff, but there is a time and a place for anger. So I'll stop there.
Often those things can coexist.
Indeed.
But on to our kind of orienting discussion about how to kind of approach strategies we use to create collective action. But we're going to start at the very basics. What does a community or coalition need to be successful? That's the question. I don't know who wants to start us off. How about Jen?
Sure. I think there's so many different factors. From my perspective, it's shared values, which I talked about a little bit, and trust, and I think also a little bit of a leap of faith. And I'll give a little story about that, about this area here where I live and the coalitions that have been built over time. In the mid 70s, there was a big push to open the St. Lawrence Seaway to winter navigation. It's always been closed. There aren't ships who go through in the winter, and there's all kinds of bad environmental things that would happen if there was winter navigation. And so there was a group of folks who were not from the area, who had summer residences here and spent time here, who had been really involved in the anti-war movement in the late 60s, early 70s, and sort of understood advocacy, understood coalition building and collective action. And they reached out to a woman named Bee Schermerhorn, who was a local person who had also been organizing on these issues around the environment and the seaway. And she kind of had her own little thing going on. And when I met Bee in the early 2000s, I asked her, I said, well, how did you get connected? How'd you guys start working together? And she said to me, she said, well, I got a call from those hippies. And she kind of like spat out that word, like hippie was a bad word. This is like still like 30 something years later. And I was like, okay, how's this going to go? And she said, they called and they said they were going to get together, and they knew I'd been doing some work on this, and they wanted me to come to their meeting. And she said, I hung up and I didn't want to have anything to do with them. And she said, but I sat down and thought about it. And I thought, if they believe in this place and want to protect this place as much as I do, I should at least go hear them out. Right. And so there was this leap of faith that she was willing to take, again, around the shared value. And she went to that meeting. It was messy for quite a few years. Coalitions are not easy. They're not simple. But they built trust and they were able to defeat that proposal. But, I think that's a good example of, values coming together, trust, and that little bit of a leap of faith. So be like, okay, I will sit down and at least respect you and listen, hear you out. So that's my perspective. Cal, you ideas?
Yeah, I think like at our core, humans just want to feel like they are part of something and they want to feel both valued and able to offer value. And I think that core need, like I think humans are really like we're people that or just biologically, we are people that like to be with other people. Like we do not exist in isolation. And I think a core need of humanity is to be part of something, to that kind of village mentality. And so I think in order for a community to be successful, there has to be like really clear and defined like reciprocity and also like clear and defined roles. Like each person has a different role to play within a community. And it is that like diversity of roles and diversity of what we can bring that actually make a community strong. And so I think absolutely, like I completely agree, Jen, like trust is core and that is not something that you can build overnight. Your story illuminated that it takes years really to build the proper level of trust to like really fully show up into something. And I think that also coincides with like you can build trust when you feel like I know what I need to do to contribute to this, and I know that other people also know what they need to do to contribute to this, and we can trust that we're going to do that. And so I think trust combined with like, and that also includes like being able to build empathy and understanding around, okay, like this person, the hippie, for example, in your story, like they realized that there was some sort of shared interest and being able to listen to that story, although different than their story, than B's story, like it really actually is important, I think, to have that difference of approach. And so an example that I'm thinking about is I worked with a community up in central BC with the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan nations, and they were working around fighting it back against a natural gas pipeline that was being drilled through their territory without their consent. Um, it was a very contentious issue because that community had been promised, economic vitality from this pipeline getting through and jobs and resources and all of this, and so there was a certain contingent of members of the nations that were not necessarily opposed to this idea of a pipeline. And there was also, simultaneously other nations, kind of their neighbor nations, that were, uncertain about whether they should support this pipeline or not. And so what they did was they hosted what they called a peace and unity summit. And so they were like, we are focused, and they'd been, dealing with a lot of violence from the RCMP, and as well as private security that had been hired by this corporation building this pipeline. And what they did was they first brought people, so they invited people from neighboring nations, from their own nations, and then, other scientists or activists that had been committed to supporting this effort. They brought people to the land and they took them to the land and spent a whole day experiencing what the land had to offer. And it was very, very significantly impactful. And then the next day, they had a full day of speakers. Some of it was panels around kind of the tangible, practical stuff, and then but a lot of it was elders sharing stories of their lived experience and how they'd been taken advantage of before and had been told something and then that was not delivered. And it really like worked to like use storytelling back to Jill's message, that it's really important to build empathy through sharing your lived experience. And that requires some pretty intense vulnerability. So I think there's kind of so many different facets of what it takes for a community to be successful. But like to me at its core is trust, vulnerability, empathy, and belonging.
I'll layer
And
on to that.
reciprocity. Yeah.
What were you going to say, Cal?
Oh, just and reciprocity. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to layer onto that a really clear mission and vision. Both the examples that I gave up front, Climate Ride is, there to fundraise locally for global problems like climate change and sustainability issues. the B Corp community is there to redefine success and vision in business. And so both organizations have really clear mission and visions, and people gather around those missions and kind of get together and collaborate on potential solutions based on the clarity of what their purpose is.
Awesome. Um, Moving on to the second question, could you all share some common ways you define boundaries around the breadth and depth of issues a community should cover? Um, Kel, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and I think especially right now in the time that we're living in, it feels like, and the not only just what's going on, but just our access to information, and our ability to kind of have, an awareness of like the multiple, like, the multi-crisis that we're experiencing, the poly crisis, I think is what it is also called. But like that, I think is, as much as I think it's important to be aware of what's going on in the world, it's really distracting us from having a focus and that kind of attempt at breadth of like, okay, well, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this, and I'm going to donate here, and I'm going to volunteer here, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. It's like there isn't, like, we're not capable as humans to do that much at once. It ends up, not only just burning us out, but we're not actually doing good work at that point. And so I really think that, with this kind of concept of like know your role and play that role and trust that others are going to play their role and support others in playing that role is important to actually focus and get a little bit real get deeper on something. Not to say that like if you choose to go deep on something that you don't care about other things, or you don't care about, supporting other movements or purposes or causes, but like the idea that one human can like focus on, dozens of things at once is just not realistic. So I think it's not necessarily about, getting into tunnel vision and only being aware of the one thing that you've decided to commit to, but it's about saying, okay, like this is what I know that I am skilled in. This is, connects to my lived experience. This is something that I feel like I can actually contribute to in a deep way, and really focusing on that while then, having those coalitions where you're like tied to other people doing other things and have awareness and the ability to like share your, best practices or your learnings from your own experiences, but not necessarily trying to do too much at once. That feels like, as far as like approaching burnout, that's a big key thing. Another thing I think that's important is kind of this idea of ebbing and flowing in your work. You cannot constantly be going at 100. Like that's just, again, like rest is part of this process of really kind of shifting the way that we approach our work and shifting our system in general. Like rest is revolutionary. You got to take time to recharge yourself. And I think when you have that level of community trust, that's really key to building communities. You can trust that if you take a step back momentarily or for however long you need, that other people are going to pick up, the work that you've had to step away from. And that when you're able to really be, full on, you might be compensating for other people who are taking a step back. And that is, again, just like balance and trust and communication, and really being able to like share the burden and the weight of all of this work.
For sure.
Yeah, and I
Tim,
think,
go
oh,
ahead, Jen. Sorry.
no, I was just going to add on to Kel's point about being sort of specific and sort of narrow and deep. I think that's also important when like in an advocacy coalition, when you're coming into partnership with people that you don't necessarily know or have a whole lot of trust with. Starting off on one small specific piece of whatever your bigger issue is that you want to tackle, that helps right off the bat you can start to build that trust, right? If you're going to save the whole world all at once with your new coalition, it probably may
Good
not
luck.
end well for you, right? But starting, especially when you're bringing in people that you don't necessarily have a lot of experience working with, or or a lot of built up trust, starting on a really narrow coalition. And then over time, you may be able to expand and grow and widen your lens and your focus. But being really specific and targeted is, I think, really important to start.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd also say understanding your kind of group capacity and their strengths, whether you do like a, strengths finder assessment or a SOAR analysis, which is like strengths, opportunities, aspirations, results, or whatever, kind of workflow works for you, just understanding where your group strengths are. And then that's going to help you identify gaps. And it's also going to help you identify partners that you could fill those gaps with and stuff. And so that ultimately will help you build capacity towards whatever end that you're working towards. But understanding capacity and strengths is a really strong thing to do firsthand right up front.
That makes sense. So we have one last question for this slide, and I'm going to ask y'all to make this a lightning round. What role does size play in the impact a community can have? Starting off with Tim.
Sure. So at Mighty Bytes, we do a lot of participatory design workshops, and we find very quickly that as our workshops get larger, the exercises get more unwieldy, and they get kind of hard to manage and stuff like that. And that's exacerbated tenfold when you're talking about like an online community or a community with hundreds of members, thousands of members. The Climate Ride community that I mentioned earlier has thousands and thousands of members. So managing that tends to be, a challenge. And so there's a kind of a perceived efficacy of like the value of smaller groups, especially as we're seeing this shift back towards experiential kind of, collaboration and participation. And so, I think personally smaller groups are better. And then once you have kind of the baseline of what a smaller group can accomplish, communicate that out to a larger group and invite people in to kind of say, all right, we've got a baseline. How do we make this better? What can you bring to the table that improves upon the ideas that we've already had and stuff? And so like I said earlier, we're doing co-creation with these participatory design workshops, but then the idea is that we can, make the ideas that we come up with in these workshops grow and thrive, by inviting other people in.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen.
I'll keep it real quick. I think it depends, which is not a satisfying answer, but I've been involved with some coalitions that were relatively small as far as number of people and number of groups, but it was absolutely the right people who needed to be at the table for that moment, and they got a lot done. So I think it's more about thinking about your goals and who is at the table, and what roles they're going to play.
And Kel, you can close us
Yeah.
out on this one.
Yeah, I think it's interesting if you look at like the B Corp community for an example. Like the B Corp community is huge. It's a global community. There's thousands of businesses in this community, and yet like when you see the B Corp community do the work, it's oftentimes at a smaller scale. Like there's subgroups of the global community that are by, geographic area, and then there's subgroups within those subgroups, like the B locals that Tim and I have both been leaders of. And you often find that the real like on the ground work is getting done by the smaller groups of communities. But that said, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not part of a broader community. So I think to me it's about like replicating small grassroots level efforts and like looking at that impact as a whole. So like the B Corp community, there's 30 plus B locals. They're all doing stuff individually. If you look at them as a sole group, you might not be able to say that they are having huge impact, but if you look at the impact that all of them are having, that actually adds up to quite a lot. So to me, it is about like small action connected to larger actions.
Awesome. Thank you. Out of many, one. So on to the next slide. So the question here is, how do you combat othering in the communities you're a part of to create a sense of belonging for members of that community? Tim, start us off.
Sure. Yeah, I would just say that, first of all, this book that's up on the screen is a great resource for that. We talked about empathy a little bit earlier. and the importance of empathy and the importance of trust. All those things are needed. Sometimes it's hard to build that, especially in this contentious day and age. We use a lot of these kind of workshops that we do to kind of break down barriers between different parties and different, different stakeholders of a specific project and stuff. And, it can get a little bit more challenging as communities get larger. So making sure that you're grounding the work that you're doing and helping, people share what they're feeling and where is the commonality that you have between those. And, again, as I said up front, there's a place and a space for anger. And sometimes, these kinds of conversations, contentious as they are, can lead to anger and that's not typically very productive. And so if you're gonna, go the anger route, make sure that you're channeling it appropriately. And if you're not, make sure that you're, grounding the work that you do in trust and empathy and stuff.
Awesome. Cal, who does to go?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one because I think, despite the potential shared intention or value or purpose that you all come together with, you're all going to have different reasons for why you care about that. You're all going to have different lived experiences, different identities that you're holding, and any situation where there is a diverse range of people that are participating in something, there's gonna be the potential of people feeling like they're not part of something. And so I think in order to like try to stop people from feeling like they're outsiders, I think part of this is having really clear expectations of how people behave in a space. So like we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but like having like guidelines around like this is how you're expected to behave, and if you're not behaving in this way, then there will be some sort of accountability structure. I think another piece of it is, getting back to that trust and vulnerability. Like if we can create a space that people are modeled, that it's okay to share when you're feeling a way that is not necessarily feeling belonging, that can be named and then it can be addressed. Like, but that doesn't happen without like that intention being set, and that being modeled in a way. So I think it's really like important to have that kind of space that feels like it's okay to bring these things up. And again, I think this is kind of comes back to like this need for urgency and trying to like get to the thing as fast as you possibly can. That often really causes people to kind of set aside those differences or those feelings that are coming up because they're like, oh, well, this isn't important. We just need to get the work done. But like, actually, I would argue that that is the work, almost more so than whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, because really what we need to do in our communities is shift the way that we're behaving and really shift our priorities. And I think like that starts with having human to human experiences where you can actually see someone for their whole self and be able to be like, all right, like I see that it's not the experience I have, but I can see that your experience is this and you're sharing that and I honor that. That's really like all it takes. That's so much easier said than done. But yeah, I think that's a huge part of it.
Jen, you want to weigh in as a communications director?
Yeah. Yeah, I was working with someone who was relatively new to coalition building, and they said to me like, geez, this is a whole lot of chit chat, right? But it gets to your point, Kel, of like, there's like, okay, we have a task, we want to get it done, just get it done, get it done, get it done. And, especially people who might find themselves more of a leadership role in a coalition or community, touching base and finding opportunities to just connect with people and have conversations. Feel about how are you doing? What are you feeling? How are things going? That may not have anything to do with like what the language in a bill that you're trying to pass is, right? Is so important. And I think it's even more important now. Early, I'm going to show how old I am, but early in my career, right? Like you had to meet in person, right? You didn't, you could maybe get on a conference call or something, but you had to have those face-to-face interactions, which are often more conducive just for the chat about the weather or somebody's tennis game or something. And it's harder. to build that sometimes online, because it's easy for us to just get on a call, bang, bang, bang through our agenda. And so making space for that chit chat and those smaller conversations, that sometimes is the most important place where you might be able to see like, ooh, is this starting to fray? Is somebody feeling left out, or somebody have an opinion that isn't being heard? That communication is, I think, is super important, and finding ways to do that in an online scenario, a digital world, is really important.
I just want to +1 that, Jen, because I think like as cheesy as like icebreaker questions can be, if you can find a way to like really add some intention and meaning to them, they can
Mhm.
actually be so significant as far as
Yeah.
like helping people get to know each other. Like if you're
Mhm.
on a call, like I don't know, I'm the type of person, if I'm on a call, like a planning call with a group of even like, 10 plus people or something like that, and I have no idea who they are, and I don't know what their story is. I don't know what their lived experience is. Like, I'm not going to be able to really show up in a full way. Like, because I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't have trust. I don't know I don't know if I say something that's gonna, how you're gonna
Mhm.
respond to that. Like, just having all those layers of thoughts of like curiosity, questioning, uncertainty is gonna change the way you behave in a space. So having that like small talk, although it might feel like a waste of time, it really isn't. Like it
Yeah.
really like that is how you get to know people. It is what it is. And that takes time.
All right, I'm going to note that we are about 5 minutes before we said we were going to wind this conversation down, and we still have one full section. So let's keep these answers quick if we can, just to respect everybody's time who's attending and joining us.
Thank you. So we're on to governance. So first question, in the communities you're involved with, how do you approach curation and moderation versus facilitation and collaboration and co-creation to create more inclusive groups? That is a mouthful of a question. Tim, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, it is a mouthful of a question, and it's definitely a challenging thing to do for sure. I think, especially, we've had, 15 plus years of community curation from marketers a lot in our world. And they're not necessarily communities as much as they are, kind of places for resource sharing. And I guess there's a certain element of community to that, but I think the the oftentimes the varying perspectives is given what we were just talking about, the varying perspectives of people in these communities and the strengths that they bring to the table often get lost in those kind of two-dimensional online interactions and stuff. And so, figuring out how to, build that environment where you can, provide, understand what value you provide to a community, and how can you help the others who also can provide other different value to that community, help lift those folks up. So I'll just leave it at that.
Jen, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd say this is another it depends, which again, not a super helpful answer. But some groups would prefer, right? They want a really strong, very specific hierarchical governing structure. And some groups want and need to keep it a little looser. And I think some of that really depends on your goals as a coalition, what you're trying to accomplish, and your comfort working together, and how well you have worked, how long you've worked together. So, Cal.
Yeah, I would say I deeply believe that structure is liberating. Meaning like if you understand how you're supposed to show up in a space, you know what the expectations of you are, and you know what your goals are, then you get to decide how that happens as a participant. So, but if you go into a space where you're like, well, I don't know what's going on, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to participate, I'm not really like there's so little structure around something that can be really like it can be really challenging to try to work with, and it can be
Right.
really limiting, I think, and even like can
Intimidating.
yeah. So like
Yeah.
I deeply believe that like the right structure is really key to success. That said, Jen, I think it does vary. Like some people need more, some people need less, but I think that's where the kind of trust building and then co-creation comes in, is like, okay, like let's as a group decide what the right level of structure is. But if you're inviting somebody into a space at least having some sort of baseline. This is what we're asking of you. This is what you can expect from us, is really, really important.
Awesome, thanks. So last question. Uh, Following up on this, how do you kind of track success, define and maintain measurements for community progress over time, which is kind of a complicated one, community. Um, Tim, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at Mighty Bytes, a lot of our work is grounded in measurable KPIs and figuring out what the data is around defining success and all that kind of stuff. So, of course, I'm going to lead with that. But I also want to, make sure that that gets, put alongside regular check-ins, with community members and making sure you're taking a step back to assess what's working and what's not. Oftentimes in my experience, you define a set of KPIs up front and you're like, hey, these are the important things that we need to make sure that we're being successful. And then 6 weeks later, they're all out the window, or you've learned 10 new things and all of those things need to change. And so just understanding what is it that we need to define success? What are the kind of, measurement structures we have to put in place? And then, making sure that it's somebody's responsibility to kind of maintain that like diversity of thought and perspectives and strengths and all that kind of stuff. So that you can, that you're keeping the measurement true, but also being flexible enough that you can change as time goes on.
Cool. Jen.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I think the thing I would add is that it's okay for coalitions or communities to sort of ebb and flow. There is a sort of a natural energy. The urgency sometimes is there, sometimes it's not. And so I think it's okay to, when a coalition is sort of on the ebb side of things, that doesn't necessarily always mean a bad thing. Sometimes people need to recharge. Sometimes you're just waiting for something to happen on your issue. If you're in an advocacy campaign. And so, it isn't always a linear progress, sort of like our little chart on the scene here. Cal?
Yeah, I think it's important to figure out or to like note the difference between qualitative and quantitative goals as well. Like
Yeah.
in communities, it's can be very challenging to quantitatively measure success.
Absolutely.
I don't know how to measure trust. I don't know how to measure vulnerability and empathy. I don't think we should try.
Yeah.
Even, and so I think just acknowledging that you might not be able to predict or create goals around like numbers that you might get as an outcome. I mean, obviously there's ways of measuring, what are your goals and did you accomplish those goals or not? But I think that it is very important to also highlight that, if your community has strong trust, that is a huge success. And I'm not an expert in measuring those things. So.
Yeah, and my point was, I think that those things should live in tandem. Like
Yeah,
we absolutely, because you do need some sort of metrics to say, hey, we did this thing and this is how we measured it. But I completely agree with you 100% that that like there's a lot of squishy stuff in there that's not so easy to assign a number to. That's for sure.
Great points.
I think one last thing that we are going to share before we turn it over to Q&A is we have this code of ethics and Nicole will share the link in the chat. If you've already done it. Looks like you direct messaged me to Nicole just for what it's worth. But anyway, we were talking a lot as we were preparing for this event about like what are some good clear community guidelines, and I think B-Lab has these are pulled directly from their website. You can find them the link as well. I think B-Lab has a really great a set of them. They're simple, they're to the point. They've been around for almost 10 years now, I think, and they have evolved in that time. But I think, having a set of community guidelines is really important for any successful community. And so sharing this in case it is of use to you all.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add the last, those community guidelines are only as good as they are actually followed and held accountable to. So I think a huge part of, I think I mentioned this earlier, but a huge part of, if you're going to set guidelines, there has to be a way of holding them. And what happens if they're not followed.
Yep, yeah. We
Yeah.
did have a section on taking collective action, but we've actually covered most of the questions in that section already. So I'm just going to skip beyond that and go ahead, Nicole, if you want to talk about Q&A.
Yeah, we can absolutely go to Q&A, but I want to call out a comment that we have in the chat, which
Sure.
is from Noel, who making the suggestion that everybody take masking into account when community building. Our chronically ill and disabled and immunocompromised population are growing by the day, and many of these people are unable to access communities due to their lack of proactive precautions. So, that's something that matters a lot to me. So, as we're talking about kind of in-person coalition building, which is important, just always keep in mind that there is a question about accessibility there. And so, when you build
Absolutely.
those spaces, try to make those as accessible as possible.
100%.
All right, on to Q&A. So we have one question here that is actually a few questions. So I'll just start with the first one. So what are your best practices for navigating past young people's anxiety and social awkwardness towards belonging and constructive collaboration, shared values, expressed respect for the individuals, safe space for disagreement, create an environment where participants feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves? Um, what are they missing to be successful with this? And I think that all of those are probably uh, answered the question, but they're very difficult to do. But I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that.
I would push back and say that it's not just young people that experience this,
Yeah,
because I think everybody on some level can feel a little bit of anxiety around participating in a new group. And I mean, I think this kind of just comes back to really the trust building for me. I I think it's the question I would ask, if that's a specific problem you're experiencing is specifically around young people. I would kind of wonder like what it is, how is your community set up, and maybe there's something that's feeling a little bit challenging for young people to participate in for some reason. But I definitely think it is about like uh creating a space that people are accessing in the way that they want to access it too. I know that like generational differences around like just call me on the phone versus like if you
right.
call me, like I will not answer. Like that could be a generational difference. So there's differences in ways that people interact based on their generational norms. And so I would maybe just try to like think about that a little bit and make sure that there's ways to like expand the opportunities or the ways in which we can interact with each other. But I think you're onto it with kind of the suggestive questions
Yeah,
that
yeah.
well.
Just to add to that, I think onboarding is a really important part of community building, particularly when you're talking about younger people. If you're talking about an older organization, make sure that you're bringing people in a way that's kind of guided, because though you might feel comfortable with the people that you're around, somebody with no experience with y'all probably is starting from a different place.
Yeah, yeah.
So mentorship can be helpful with this, but there's also just different types of programming.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, S- Here's a second question. Any advice for methods of collecting feedback from a small community and inspiring a culture of building strength and maturity of a community, aka a community-led green team?
Yeah, well, I think you should start off with this one, given how experiential all of the kind of event-related things that you do are. And I have some thoughts too, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I'm just letting this sink in for a second. Feedback, I mean, I think as many methods of feedback that you can offer for people to take is the best. Meaning if they want to fill out a form versus if they want to have a one-on-one conversation versus if they want to be in like a collective dialogue experience or just send an email. I mean, like honestly, like people are going to want to answer questions or want to participate in various different ways.
Right.
Personally, I'm much more likely to sit down and have a conversation with someone than to take 10 minutes to fill out a survey because it really like
Yeah.
it's harder for me. I'm a verbal processor. So like I think having different varying ways and I think, you know, asking the right questions, like not asking leading questions, asking questions that are like, you know, what does this, how does this make you feel? Like, what are the emotions that come up when you participate in this? Or, you know, like are you feeling like a benefit from participating in this? And what are those benefits? What do you feel like you're offering? You know, really trying to get at that, like, what are you getting out of this and what do you feel like you're giving I think is kind of an important piece of that. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I think everything plus one to everything you just said. I'm consistently kind of gobsmacked when talking to our clients who are not necessarily building communities, but you know they all have donors or customers or really important stakeholder groups that are you know key to helping their organization thrive. And when you know we're asking about what they know about these customers or these donors or whoever they might be or the communities they're trying to serve, they often come up blank, and you know sometimes we'll just flat out say, well, have you asked them? And it's surprising to me the number of times we've gotten responses where that had just never really occurred to them. And I kind of, you know, I'm always shocked by that. But you know, to your point, Cal, everybody wants to communicate in different ways, but we're also all really inundated with very impersonal ways to connect with people. And so the more personal you can potentially make it, you know, the UX world likes to call them stakeholder interviews, which sound really dry and boring and not fun at all. But like, you know, like one-on-one meaningful conversations are really important. And so I just definitely advocate for those and using the language with the people that you're talking to so that it resonates with them as well. Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you guys covered it really well. Plus one to everything.
Awesome. So next question here is kind of about managing conflict in communities. So is there a way to guide disagreements that happen in community? Have we found any strategies that are more successful than others?
Toxic masculinity always works, right? Kidding, of
Okay.
course, kidding.
Tried and true.
All right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think mediators are helpful. I know that's kind of old school, but I think sometimes when two folks within a community are really, you know, at each other's throats, you know, bringing in someone to kind of facilitate the conversation between those, not to you know, get in the way, but just to help facilitate that bridging that needs to happen. Because there's clearly, whenever two people are in a disagreement about something and that disagreement becomes heated, there's some sort of othering going on between them two and the two. And so figuring out how to bridge that gap is really important. And sometimes a seasoned, you know, mediator can kind of help with that. That's my 2 cents on this.
I think something that comes up a lot in conflict resolution is that people just try to like jump to the solution and they're like
Yeah.
totally missing the impact and the emotions involved and the repair that needs to be done first. Because, like, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a situation where I'm not feeling emotionally safe or not heard or feeling frustrated or any sort of like a negative emotion, I can't get to a solution. Even if you give me the best solution, it's not going to work because I'm still feeling, you know, not great. So I think kind of really focusing on like, okay, like what was the harm? Let's get to the place of like where can we resolve or get to a better place of at least being heard and being able to process that emotion and then let's move on to the solution. I think is really important and something that often gets overlooked. But I will say like also I think conflict is actually really important. It's a super important part of community building. It's absolutely inevitable. If you don't have conflict, then you're probably not doing it right. And like I think this idea that again, trying to move through it quickly and just being like, all right, well, let's get to the solution, move on, is really missing the point. So like taking the time to actually spend on the repair will serve you so much better in the long term. And really that's like a huge that's how you build trust actually, is getting through conflict. So I think really understanding that there is a lot of value in conflict, and to try to move through it too quickly is doing a disservice to everybody involved.
I moved us back a couple slides because number 2 in B Lab's community guidelines is get comfy with discomfort, stretch yourself. And I think that's really, really, really key.
Awesome. Um, that is almost all of the questions that we have here. So maybe we should move on to the kind of wrap up. I
Yep.
think.
We're
Great.
coming up on time, so that's great.
All right. Cal, would you like to tell us about where we can find you and about your organization?
Yeah, so I am Alluvium Gatherings. It's really just me. But and most of the work that I do is anywhere from like, project management of an event. I do a lot of work around experience design. So like thinking about how do we want to spend the time that we have in a way that's going to make, the most impact. And then, I do some like, working around like just building out structures for like ongoing events and processes, and what have you. You can check out my website, alluviumgatherings.com. You can email me at kel@alluviumgatherings.com, and always open to having conversations with folks.
And where can they find Mighty Bites?
Thanks, Nicole. You can find us at mightybytes.com. Maybe Nicole will put in some LinkedIn URLs for Nicole and I. If you want to connect with us on LinkedIn, definitely open to having conversations as well. And appreciate everybody's joining us today. Jen.
Yeah, and like Kel, I am a one-person business too. So you can find me at bowie231consulting.com. I also have a weekly newsletter with practical tips for advocacy and other communication. So you can sign up for that. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn. And as Tim said, huge thanks to everyone. This was a great conversation. And thank you, Kel, for bringing your expertise and your perspective to the conversation today. I hope everybody found it helpful, and there were some great questions from our listeners.
For sure. Yeah, real quick, just before we're coming up on the top of the hour, so I'm just going to quick whiz through these. And hopefully, Nicole, if you wouldn't mind sharing the registration links, that would be great. We do have 3 more webinars coming up in this series. So our next one is on organizational agility, innovation, and inclusion with Jennifer Sconiers from Abundance Leadership Consulting. And that's going to be a really great kind of conversation about kind of taking these community building ideas that we talked about today and focusing them inward on our own internal teams. So that's going to be coming up on April 1st. It is not an April Fool's joke, I promise. We have a community collaboration on April 17th at 11 a.m. And that is literally an open format where we're going to be breaking into breakout rooms and asking people to come in and bring some of their biggest communications and community building challenges that they're having right now, because there are a lot of them, and doing some kind of collective participatory problem solving together. So that's on April 17th. And then finally, our last one is with my good friend Andrew Boardman from Mangrove, another B Corp web development firm out on the West Coast. And we're going to be talking about the role of design and design practices in an age of autocracy. And that's on May 1st at noon Eastern time. So thank you again, everybody, for this time and for the great questions and the good conversation. We hope you'll join us for future ones, and look forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn or other ways. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks, everybody.